Hello and welcome to the World Deciphered, coming to you this week from London. I'm your host, Cipher Brief CEO and publisher, Suzanne Kelly. We're talking in today's program with Cipher Brief expert and former senior member of the British Foreign Office, Nick Fishwick, about Russian information operations. The interview comes on the heels of the release of a 32-page indictment in the United States accusing the Kremlin of pouring millions of dollars into media organizations that are trying to influence U.S. opinion. Of course, it's coming 2 months before the U.S. presidential election. Also in the show, Cipher Brief Chief International Correspondent Muermishvili from Tbilisi, where she sat down with 2 Eastern European leaders who are calling on Western countries to support Ukraine's efforts as it defends itself from Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine by lifting restrictions on Ukraine's use of long-range weapons to target Russian airfields deep inside Russian territory. But first, let's check in with Cipher Brief Managing Editor Tom Nagorski for a look at the other stories that are dominating the headlines around the world this week. Tom?
Suzanne, beyond the big RT story, we're following a couple of places that until recently weren't that well known and were pretty far from the headlines. And first, the city of Poltava in central Ukraine, site of one of the worst attacks of the war, is also, however, driving 2 core questions beyond the attack itself. One, why was a military training academy not better protected, particularly given the issues that the Ukrainians have had with manpower? Why won't the U.S. and the West drop the restrictions they have had in place on the use of long-range weapons that they've given to Ukraine against targets in Russia? You could sense some real anger this week over that latter question, not just from President Zelensky, but from a lot of officials outside Ukraine and certainly a lot of analysts, including in the Cipher Brief expert community. So we've been watching that. And then another dateline, super important for a different reason, is that small sliver of territory in Gaza called the Philadelphia corridor, running along the southern border of Gaza with Egypt. And sometimes a very small patch of land can carry huge geopolitical significance, and that's certainly the case here. We had several briefings from U.S. officials this week that made clear that while other issues continue to get in the way of a Gaza peace deal, this is a big one. Israel insists on keeping forces in the Philadelphia corridor. Hamas wants the Israeli military out completely from Gaza. And Egypt doesn't want the Israelis in there either. And they're a part of the negotiations. So this is a big issue. Here's what Netanyahu himself said about the Philadelphia corridor this week. Quote, "People say, if you stay, this will kill the deal. And I say, such a deal will kill us." Tough slog for the negotiators. And finally, Suzanne, in the category of news that got a little less attention this week, a couple of important signs that Vladimir Putin still has no trouble winning friends and allies around the world. There was first a major report from the Financial Times on the extent to which Russia continues to get a lot of revenue from India, from oil sales. And then the news here really is that Russia has been using that revenue to buy dual-use technology from India. That's a big sanctions workaround for the Russians, and therefore a big thing to watch. And then there was Vladimir Putin this week getting a warm welcome in Mongolia. Why does that matter? Well, as you know, the International Criminal Court has issued a warrant for the arrest of Putin on charges of war crimes. Mongolia is the first member nation of the International Court that Putin has visited. So it's technically their obligation to arrest him. Well, faced with the choice of doing that or keeping its warm ties and economic ties with Russia, Mongolia didn't just welcome Vladimir Putin, arrest him for anything, it rolled out the red carpet. Suzanne, back to you in London.
And joining me now is someone who knows a lot about Russian information operations, Cipher Brief expert and former senior member of the British Foreign Office, Nick Fishwick. Nick, I'm very interested on your perspective on what's happening with Russian information operations, with covert operations. You've been dealing with this in the UK for decades. What is it that you think Americans need to know about how active these measures really are?
I think they need to know that it's a threat to their way of life, it's a threat to their society, it's a threat to their deepest values. I think one of the deepest values that we share in common with the United States and our European partners and other countries as well is a belief in democracy and a knowledge that democracy is fair and it works. and the Russians are trying to undermine that. Now, as you said, Suzanne, I've looked at that for many years personally. We know that going right back to the early days of the Soviet Union, the 1920s and before, the Russians were actively using propaganda attempts to influence public opinion, to undermine our democracy. But I think now it's more serious than it's been at any stage, at least since the 1950s, because I think the Putin regime is under more threat than it's been before. Therefore, the Russians see it as more of an existential battle. In any way that they can hurt us, they think that's an automatic gain for them. And because Putin is under so much pressure now, he's fighting harder and he's fighting dirtier. And I think people need to remember that it will affect their way of life. It will affect their ability to have free elections that they can rely on, media that they can rely on, and therefore a shared culture, which is what Western democracy should have.
There's already at this moment so little trust in sources of information by Americans at large. It seems like that is an issue. Nick, let me ask you, it's difficult for people to really understand something when they don't see how it comes together. But there are allegations within this latest indictment, for example, where Russia is sometimes bringing in other people unwittingly. They might not even know that Russia is funding these operations. How are they so successful at this time after time after time?
Well, I would think that using people unwittingly increases your scope for influence. The number of people who are going to do this willingly is, thank God, it's quite low. Therefore, what you're going to do is to try and broaden that network by just using people who don't know what's happening, who think they're getting some moral or financial support from a media organisation that they're running, or somebody who happens to believe in the same thing as them, without asking questions about where the person that's offering this wonderful help is coming from. So I think using people who are not aware that it's under Russian government control enhances the scope for the Russians to use more people to influence our views.
And it's difficult as the consumer of information to sometimes know what questions to ask about where you're getting your sources of information from. How do you think about it from the information consumer perspective? What do you think about when you're trying to sort of critically assess your sources of information and what you believe when we're living in an age where people get their news online now? It's no longer the old days of the newspapers.
I think number one, I would ask critical questions about the media that I'm relying on. So, frankly, if I'm looking online at most newspapers, British and American and European newspapers, I know what I'm dealing with, and I know there's a basic respect for truth. It does vary a bit from newspaper to newspaper. I know that with the BBC and the leading Western media organisations. Some are less well clear than that, and I think if I was relying on them, I'd just do a bit of research into who they are, who controls them, where they're based. I'd also just use my antennae. What's my own kind of antennae? So what British school children are taught to do now is to try and be critical in when they read things. So why are they being told this? Why are these particular words being used? So that even school children are being taught to develop their critical faculties to ask questions about whether what's in front of them is reliable or not. Does something strike you as being strange? Is it likely to be in somebody's interest that this story is being there? If you see photographs, you can doctor photographs in incredibly sophisticated ways these days, but if a photograph seems a bit weird, I would ask a question about whether that photograph is genuine or not.
One of the other measures that Russians have been known to use is not necessarily creating chaos or division, but simply exploiting chaos or division that already exists. What lessons do you have from how you've seen that play out here in the UK for the US?
Well, number one, they will target people who are saying things which they think not necessarily are in their interest, but which are against our interests, and they will try and manipulate things that they're saying to cause disruption. They will use quite a substantial amount of money to do that. If they think it's going to have real impact, they will spend quite a lot of money. They will try and hide the source of that money, so it won't come in a big, swag bag with SVR written all over it. It'll be harder to spot than that. So there are lots of different things that they can do. And also, of course, the media that they use is way more diverse than it was when I was a young person starting off working for the British government. So they will use lots of different media as receptacles for money, for influence, for people who they insert or they unwittingly use to advance the messages that they want to get over.
I don't know if this is an easy answer or not. I'm guessing not, but how do you stop this as a government, Nick?
You know, we started this conversation by you asking me about, I think, about whether people are taking it seriously enough. I think they're not. And I think government has a responsibility, our government and Western European governments and governments like the US and other allies, to make it clear what is at stake here. It's not a bit of, you know, it's not a bit of niche influence or intelligence work by the Russians. It's going to the heart of our lives. And I'd give you an example of what's worrying about politics in Britain and Europe. What people worry about is extreme right-wing politics. They worry about extreme left-wing politics as well, but we had riots in this country that seemed to be about nationalists who wanted to get their point of view over it, in a few cases violently. The Russians will be desperate to exploit that, and some of these extreme right political groups are getting support of different sorts from the Russians. Now, I'm not saying they're invalid and illegitimate. They will have proper support by people who believe in whatever it is that those people are propagating, but there'll be lots of ways in which the Russians are trying to manipulate that, and from my perspective and from many other people's perspectives, that is eroding the consensus and the centre ground in Western politics, and that's eroding our ability to function as a democracy moving forward together. So people should be aware that extremist organisations, or just quite extreme organisations, in the UK, in Europe, in other parts of the world, probably in the US as well, are being manipulated by the Russians, and they're being manipulated as never before, using sources that have not been used before, using amounts of money that's not been available before, and by using media that's much harder for Westerners to be aware of. So we need awareness, we need politicians to give a lead on this, to make speeches about it, to encourage the media to look into these things. Our consciousness needs to be raised.
In the U.S., there was a congressionally appointed bipartisan group of national security experts and leaders who just filed a report saying that Americans in general really have no idea about the seriousness of the threats facing them today. Do you have a similar issue in the UK? And if so, what's the answer to that?
Well, I don't know whether it's a congressional report, but yes, we do, as I've been saying, have at least as serious a problem as that. We've got we're a very cynical people, the British, so when people start talking about Russian influence, I think a lot of British people, I suspect particularly young people, are disinclined to believe it. So I think there's no dramatic answer to this, but I think the only answer that's going to work is it becoming an issue of policy, it becoming an issue of security. As I say, politicians talking about it, there need to be debates about it in the House of Commons, there need to be articles about it in mainstream British media and other respectable media. So we just need our consciousness raising in lots of ways like that. Probably other people can think of smarter ways. If it doesn't get done by people with smarter ideas than I've got for doing it, we're going to keep facing extremist politics, undermining our ways of life, and that's playing absolutely into Putin's playbook.
Yeah. Nick Fishwick, former senior member of the British Foreign Office, and very proud to call you a Cipher Brief expert. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks, a pleasure.
I'm Muermishvili here in Tbilisi, Georgia, where I had the opportunity to talk to two Baltic leaders about Russia's war in Ukraine and upcoming US elections. Marko Mihkelson is the Estonian Parliament's Foreign Relations Committee chairman, and Rihards Kols is a member of the European Parliament, formerly Latvian Parliament's Foreign Relations Committee chairman. This is what they had to say. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us today at this beautiful venue in Tbilisi, Georgia, at the conference. I would like to, because you both represent Baltic countries, I would like to start from the Baltic perspective on what's happening regarding Russia and Ukraine and your outlook as to how you see the war in Ukraine. What happens if Russia wins the war? And what happens if Russia loses the war? If we could start with you, please.
I think answer is rather simple. If Russia succeeds, in its efforts to destroy Ukraine's statehood, but this is their sort of ultimate goal when it comes to question of their aggression against Ukraine, then obviously they won't stop there. As Putin has declared openly, that Russia's strategic goal is to not only change geopolitical reality in Eastern Europe, but to change the world order. And this is why they are building a sort of alliance, or they try at least to build sort of an alliance with China, with Iran, North Korea, and as we know, they are very much interested to fuel up tensions in the Middle East, in the Sahel region. Obviously, in interest of China, Russia is also tensions in East Asia. And this is why we argue, and also perhaps we have to realize those who tell us that, you know, we have to be careful deterring Russia because that might escalate situation and then we might end up in a World War III. Then I argue that if we don't today help Ukraine to win in this war, then we easily can witness that we are suddenly in a major global conflict. And vice versa. If Ukraine will win in this war, Russia will be defeated, strategically defeated, meaning winning in this war, for me at least, is that Ukraine restores its sovereignty over territory and international borders, which are recognized from 1991. Plus also Ukraine will be invited to become member of NATO. And that will help us, obviously, to change geopolitical calculus, not only in regard of Ukraine, but also in Belarus and Georgia.
Rihards, what's the situation as Latvia is looking at Russia? What are your biggest concerns, again, in the prism of Ukraine war?
Right now, the most important thing is to implement NATO summit decisions in practice. One thing is to have on a paper, that is to boost the defense capabilities, both in Baltics but also widely in the region, including Sweden and Finland as well. That will take not only time but also considerable financial resources as well. That means there's a clear recognition within the governments, within the parliament, on the continuous increase on defense expenditure as well. And of course, well, on top of that, you mentioned the domestic dimensions. And actually, there's still very high support within the society supporting Ukraine, more than 80%. There are, you know, who are trying to spread the narratives of Kremlin that there is a war fatigue by different means and in different ways. But we're going ahead. We actually, what we are doing is actually physically militarizing our border. That is a clear signal that we are ready for the potential aggression. It's not only theoretical right now consideration, but practical. And of course, what we see right now at the border with Russia is we're laying out the anti-tank mines. We are putting the dragon thieves and so on, and it's a necessity to be done. It's showing that we mean what we say, and that is a deterrent already by other means and scale. But this is something that mainly is actually a signaling to our colleagues within Europe. Because if you go to Luxembourg, you have a colleague who's complaining that he suffered too much already during the Cold War. And you sit and you puzzle. How did you suffer? Please elaborate.
In Luxembourg,
yes, well, the sausage was, you know, more cheaper or something like that. Look, this is a challenge that we're having within Europe. It's the defense military industry, its capability to produce, to deliver. Yes, we have one commitment announced after another, but we lack on delivering on those commitments.
That's exactly what I want to ask you from the EU perspective now. We're hearing about this money that's available, but that's not being...
too little. It's still...
it's too little, but it's not even present, right? It's not
yes,
being
1.5 billion. It's for the Europe's defense initiative program. What is also unpleasant news that our strategic partners across the ocean are excluded in participating in those programs. That is short-sighted. That is something where, somebody who's bragging about the strategic autonomy is actually pushing its national interests. I will not name which, but there are not numerous countries in Europe that are capable of delivering on those means that Europe needs right now, especially when it comes to air defense. And this makes us really dependent on the US. Not in a bad way. It actually can help in a domestic discussion in the US. We've been extensively traveling to Washington this year and last year alone as well, particularly engaging with those representatives of the Congress that are maybe hesitant or negatively lean towards Ukraine, particularly arguing on those things where they're misled with disinformation, particularly, for example, who?
By whom, yes.
Well, there are, just pick up the voting list on the supplementary item on Ukraine. They're there. 122 Republicans. Those are the ones we have to continue to work with. There's so huge disinformation spread, and be it even from domestic media, Tucker Carlson, right, spreading as well. Elon Musk with Twitter actually emphasizing that. It's very interesting twist. Sorry for citing from the topic you asked, but you saw how Elon Musk was, Twitter is dominated with Russian trolls. Right, and he's somewhat as well leaning in the side of Republicans, Trumpist way, and so on. But now, when the country is shutting down Twitter, he's calling to sanction that country, Brazil.
Let's leave that part aside for a different conversation, but come back to the issue that you raised, the issues that you're seeing from over the ocean. America has elections coming up, and the two candidates, we know who they are. What's your perspective on what the foreign policy could be of if Trump is elected or if Harris is elected? Do you have an outlook, and do you anticipate and prepare for either one of those?
Obviously, from the end result of U.S. elections will depend a lot what kind of policy is carried out towards allies, towards Ukraine, and what can be done, let's say, differently than up to this moment. I argued today here, and not only here, during different meetings, also in the United States and then European capitals as well. And this is not only the question to the United States and the next administration. It's about coming back to this very first question you said, do we, as allies, are on the same page or not? And unfortunately, I must say, we are not on the same page. We are not on the same page with strategic goals, what we have to agree upon and then to implement it. And think about, we still don't say the same way in Washington and in Tallinn or in Riga that Russia must be defeated. We say we don't hear this in Washington. So if you don't have the kind of clear vision what should the end game, then obviously the policy is also not fully directed to that goal, or the question of Ukraine's membership in NATO. I must say the NATO summit in Washington was unfortunately failure, and I don't see in that regard failure, that we gave Russia against signal that we are afraid of Russia. We try not to somehow consider their worries, and so it's. I hope that those who will be in either administration understand that from outcome of a war in Ukraine will depend also the future national security of the United States. When it comes to the question of China, when it comes to the question of the Middle East, Sahel region, and so.
There is a conversation now at this conference, as well as Poland is very actively voicing this idea that maybe it's time for NATO to start protecting Ukraine's skies from the NATO territory, but make sure that certain incoming missiles, at least, that may be threatening NATO should be shut down. Where do you stand on that, proposal?
Are becoming new news. Actually, the Baltic countries were the first actually calling for no-fly zone right after 24th of February. We were ridiculed in so many different ways. That is being raised. Of course, right now, when we have those, I will not call them incidents, some intentional actually testing. What are the limitations? So what is the response from the NATO countries? It's not only Poland, it's Romania, it's Moldova. There's casualties, actually. Yes. It's not just, somewhere in the field. There's in Poland, if I'm not mistaken, two farmers were killed as well. So I think it definitely has to be in the range of, and that's, we can explain by international law as well, protecting our airspace as well. And that's, concluding all the way, I think, till Kiev. That is the range that we should announce that is this airspace that we're going to protect. Any projectile launch from Russia will be shut down.
Do you think consensus could be reached on that?
Well, the question is, at some point, it doesn't have to be consensus. Even providing military assistance to Ukraine is not consensus-based. It's actually individual member states of NATO are delivering. It's their own national decision. And here, as well, if Poland decides, well, they soon will have enough Patriot systems as well. I hope that we'll start to produce Patriot systems in Poland. That is also coming back to the military industry complex. But I think on what very well put Foreign Minister of Lithuania just recently, Landsbergis, is that we do everything to protect the legitimate targets in Russia rather than people of Ukraine. And that is something that needs to be, I mean, he really put it out as it is.
And would you add to that, and also maybe add the whole concept of not allowing Ukraine, on top of that, it's also a big topic, but on top of that, not allowing Ukraine to use some of the Western, especially American weapons, long-range weapons, to use them against military targets in Russia. What's your position?
No, absolutely. You cannot fight the fight hands tied behind your back. Ukrainians actually do miracles. And then I was just a few days back in Kharkiv region, and also Sumy region. I met those who fight on Russian territory right now. When I asked, what do you need? They said two things. First, don't please make any limitations and us to fight this fight. We can win. We show in the Kursk area that we can move on if we have enough capacity for that. And secondly, give us the right to destroy Russian airfields in close vicinity, 300 plus kilometers to the Ukrainian borders. There are 22 airfields they use to shoot gliding bombs and other stuff against Ukraine. So that is a simple issue to do, and that is not escalatory. The Ukrainians have shown crossing border and starting the war on Russian territory that is exactly what should be done in order to make a breakthrough in this war that should lead to the victory of Ukraine. And last but not least, also deliveries. We have promised, collectively a lot, including America. And Ukrainian colleagues showed me the list of those items of military equipment which was promised in April. And up till now, behind of those promised numbers which have been delivered are zeros on many items. So you cannot fight the fight if you are promised some help and you don't know when this help will come.
You wanted to add something?
Yeah, well, von der Leyen said that she's going to build the umbrella, the air defense. Then we look at the Cold War, and actually you can see the West, how many batteries of rockets they laid out next to the Iron Curtain. hundreds, in their hundreds, and they weren't afraid of escalation. They did it because it's a necessity. So right now it's actually the arguments talking about the Baltic countries. Russia hasn't relocated its batteries to aim at Baltics. Actually, still the batteries are in range for the countries actually on the other side of the Iron Curtain. That is Germany and so on. So this is right now a necessity already to reinstate those rocket systems, defense systems, along the historical line, because even Russia launches the rockets, those are not for the Baltic countries.
Yes.
It's sorry, but it's a fact. Maybe it's good for us, but it means, well, it needs to wake up the defense industry. Absolutely, the renaissance has to happen.
What is it that you want to see coming from America? If you could summarize maybe 2-3 points, what would those be?
One very clear understanding that in the interest of the United States is, together with allies in Europe, help Ukraine to win in this war. Because this is not a regional conflict. This is not something you can really park somewhere or make some Minsk-free agreement again. So you have this war should end with a clear victory of Ukraine, and Russia must be defeated. This is a unique moment for the United States as well to regain serious leadership in the world, and also, as I mentioned earlier, that will make much easier to balance growing power of China in the future. If Ukraine is defeated by Russia, the challenge for the United States will be much bigger.
Well,
how about you?
Well, I'll turn around the question. I will say what I don't want to see. I don't want to see further push for isolationism in the U.S. Politics, because what the history has shown, the policy of isolationism is the choice of losers. And what we have seen for the past 8 to 10 years, U.S. is on that track, unfortunately, both in relations to the EU, to its allies, and so on. So this is something that I don't want to see in whoever takes the office after the 5th of November, that U.S. is actually embracing the partnerships and working with allies.
I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And it's great to see you in Tbilisi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it for this edition of The World Deciphered, coming to you this week from London. I'm your host, Cipher Brief CEO and publisher Suzanne Kelly. I hope you enjoyed the program, and I also hope you check us out at decipherbrief.com. We send out an amazing Monday through Friday open source report that gets you up to speed very quickly on the latest news around the world. Find out more at decipherbrief.com. We'll see you here next week on The World Deciphered.